Hello, everybody. It's me, Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. Hello, everybody. It's me, Vicky. Timms, the great she-elephant, the matriarch, the White Zulu. You know who I am. Anyway, hello. It's that the week's gone by. I don't know how quickly, but very fast for me. And I left you the end of our wedding. We were suddenly trapped on the plane with my new in-laws, and they'd caused such a ruckus at the airport that we had to keep our heads down because the whole plane, all the passengers were so furious with the way she jumped the queue and dragged us into it. And someone had been sick on the back of on the seat, right under my nose, and they hadn't cleaned it up properly. So I'll carry on from there. If I saw someone throw up, and this applies to right up until today, it's always a close thing that I don't follow suit. I'm extremely squeamish about other people's puke, probably because my little sister Delia had always been so prone to throwing up and did so every year after guzzling on the bouche de Noël, otherwise known as the nuns' cake, a wonderful confection made by one of the sisters at the Mgeni Port Convent as a thank you to Dad for dipping their cattle every time he did his own. Because Sister Theophane's cows were Jerseys, their cream and butter was extremely rich, and the festive log roulade was liberally iced inside and out, with a thick layer of icing of both commodities. We all loved the nun's cake, but knew from bitter experience that even the smallest portion was quite sufficient, except Delia, who's never seemed to learn, and in spite of all our warnings, continued to stuff herself with it, with inevitable consequences. She'd spend the whole of Christmas night every year being copiously and noisily sick into a potty next to her bed. And since I always had to share a room with her every Christmas, as mine, the spare room, had been co-opted for guests, I had to share in the horrors of her weak stomach. Also, our loo was right far away at the end, down a long passage, and you couldn't get there in time, so we had potties under our bed just for being sick in. It got to the point when she grew a bit older and had long hair that it was Diana who had to be dragged out of bed in the middle of the night to hold Delia's hair back while she was being sick in the loo. I flatly refused, and had had my worst experience in the Kruger National Park when I was 9 and she was 6, and we were sharing a bunk. I'd bagged the top bunk and she was in the lower one in our little thatched hut at Skukuza, and our parents were merrily getting drunk outside their own hut, some distance away, with the Buxtons, friends of theirs who joined us on a game reserve trip. There were no fences around the camp, as it was as pitch dark as a bush camp can be once the generator has gone off, and I was already spooked by lying there in the dark listening to lions roaring loudly, the cackling and giggling of hyenas at a kill nearby, as well as the yips and yelping howls of jackals. Then Delia threw up loudly and splashily onto the stone floor directly under me. I swore at her, but she continued to heave up the entire contents of her stomach and feebly called for help. I wasn't going to clean up the mess. I had no idea where to start, nor did I want to. So I offered to run for help, and run I did. I climbed down off my bank, hoping to God that my bare feet were well clear of the warm puddle, the fumes of which were beginning to make me retch as well, and then began feeling my way along the wall of the rondavel by edging along my back to the cool brick wall until I reached the doorway. It was too dark to see a thing, and Mum hadn't thought of giving us even a torch. I could see why she'd confiscated the candles and boxes of lion matches, which the National Parks Board always left next to each guest's bed, as the hut had a low thatched roof, and our bunks were simply a pine frame with hessian nailed to it. The temptation of playing with the candles and matches would have been too much for us. Now I opened the stable door of our hut and stood on the threshold, staring out into the pitch dark and hoping there wasn't a lion directly outside, or a hyena, which would have been bigger than me at that age. I tried to locate Mum and Dad's whereabouts by the sound of their loud voices, and was very tempted to go back inside to the safety of our hut and wait it out till dawn. But I'm so afraid of sick that I decided to make a run for Mum's hut and take a chance with the predators rather than stay. And I ran as fast as I could into oblivion, jinking in a futile attempt to put off any big cat that might be chasing me, as I'd seen the impala do. And to my joy, I saw the glow of the log fire outside the hut next door and bolted for it, to throw myself at Mum, babbling with fright, as I tried to explain my predicament. She swore and dragged me back, using their torch to bad-temperedly clean up the mess herself, while I scrambled back onto my bunk and buried my face in my pillow so I couldn't smell that awful stink. Normally, when Delia was sick on the floor, Mum got one of the nannies or house girls in to clean it up. But there was nobody but her up in the Kruger Park, and she wasn't best pleased. It turned out that Delia's delicate digestive system couldn't tolerate sterilized milk, which was all we had, since there were no refrigerators in some of the rougher camps. At home, we'd always had our milk straight from the cows, and it wasn't even pasteurized. Now back to our honeymoon. We finally landed in Joburg, saying goodbye yet again to Bar and Bob as they had to transfer to the International Departure Building for the long flight to Heathrow. Bar cried copiously and noisily, soaking the shoulder of a mortified Fred's tweed jacket, and Bob looked miserable, and then they both left, and we waved them off with utter relief. I hope that's the last we see of them this time, said Fred emphatically. What a nightmare that was, and I wholeheartedly agreed. I have no recollection of even one detail of our first night of married life. The Carlton didn't leave a single imprint on my memory, other than a feeling of deep regret that I'd persuaded Fred to spend such an exorbitant sum on a single night in a fancy hotel. I don't know what I was thinking of at the time, as neither of us was the type that longed for smart, luxurious surroundings. Fred must have felt deeply uncomfortable there, as it must have brought back miserable memories of his ordeals, of being forced by his mother to attend debutante balls. A lot of those horrors had been held in sumptuous surroundings, in places like the Savoy, the Dorchester, and other hideously expensive establishments, where he'd spent many a dreary evening. But this time he was actually paying for a night in such a place, instead of rich hosts having to foot the vast bills for parties. He must have bitterly resented having to pay so much for one unmemorable night in such a fancy place, but he didn't let on to me, his starry-eyed 20-year-old bride, who'd probably believed it was the proper way to start one's honeymoon. I might have been influenced by a sister or two, or even my parents, but I thought it was a good idea at the time, and Fred gamely stepped up to the plate and paid the eye-watering bill the next morning without so much as a whimper. The best part by far was still to come. Our flight to Lorenzo Marques, LM, the capital and largest city of Mozambique, now known as Maputo, was my next big adventure. I was still mad keen on flying, and felt cheated that I hadn't been able to enjoy the short hop on the biggish plane from Durban to Joburg, due to having to keep my head down, almost pressed against the six-stained Freeton seat in front of me after my mother-in-law's horrible shenanigans. I'd so badly wanted to stare out of the window, but she'd bagged that seat, and the whole flight had been far from enjoyable. We loaded our not-so-smart luggage of two small soft bags containing nothing more than beach clothes and swimming costumes, snorkels and flippers, as well as the speargun, which didn't even have a canvas case, as Robin had lost that long ago, plus the dinghy with its long paddle strapped on into the boot of a taxi, and headed for Jan Smuts Airport, where we were sent off to one of the furthest gateways in departures. There was a tiny Portuguese East Airlines desk tucked away, hidden, way back among other similar down-market destination airlines, such as Swazi Air and Air Botswana, where we checked in. Everyone was very casual about the lethally dangerous speargun, which we took on board with us. In 1970, there was no such thing as a security check, and after showing our passports and tickets to a yawning Eastern Portuguese white man, we sauntered through a door across the hot tarmac runway, and climbed up the steps of a twin-prop 20-seater plane, the kind we South Africans have named the Vurvur, after those little balsa wood toy planes we flew, somewhat erratically, by winding up to its full capacity the rubber band attaching the propeller to the nose, and then launching the flimsy toy upwards. Then we chose a seat, mine next to the window at last, stowed the Speargun in the overhead compartment, and waited for takeoff. And waited, and waited. After nearly an hour seated in the now oven-like aircraft, which had stood in the summer sun for I don't know how many hours, on tarmac which it must have been well over 50 degrees centigrade by now, we still hadn't seen any signs of cabin crew. But there seemed to be a bit of a flurry and commotion going on in the cockpit. We could see through the open doorway and watched as silhouettes of various people scurried to and fro in there, flitting about, apparently aimlessly. Eventually we were all dripping with sweat and longing to either take off or be let off the plane, so we could lurk in the slightly cooler shade underneath. Some kind of explanation would have been nice too. Finally, a young white Portuguese-speaking woman in the airline livery rattled off something in her own language and then laboriously translated it into English, announcing that there'd been a delay. Of that we were now already well aware. We have been detained for some time now, she continued in her very strong accent, which was quite difficult to follow. The pilot has been unable to see, she explained, as he has some chili powder got accidentally into his eyes. And with that, she proceeded to close the door and start her routine pre-takeoff cabin check. Fred and I, as well as the other passengers, looked at each other in disbelief. Did you understand that? He asked. She said the pilot had chili powder in his eyes. I heard the same thing, I replied, and then turned to the passenger across the aisle, whom I'd overheard speaking English a little earlier on, while we were all complaining of being trapped in the hot plane. He'd been the most vociferous. Yes, that's exactly what she said, he confirmed. He was a Lorenzo Marx businessman returning to his home city after a stay in Joburg. He seemed unperturbed, as did the other East Portuguese passengers around us. So after a bit of worrying between ourselves about the state of the pilot's eyesight, Fred and I decided to settle back and relax, leaving our fate to the gods. It was a very old plane, probably built before the Second World War, and in my brother-in-law Robin's words, Portuguese East Airlines has a piss-poor safety record. He'd used them on many occasions to go on fishing trips up to remote parts of Mozambique. Robin held his own private pilot's license and warned us not to pay too much attention to the lax attitude of that country's air service. Just don't think about what could go wrong. Sit back and enjoy the scenery, he'd advised. And so we did just that. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.